The game, the eyeballs. Thanks for stopping by here at the Voice of College Football. We appreciate your viewership as well as your viewership of college football in games like Ohio State and Michigan. Please like the video, share the videos out on social media, and subscribe. It is called The Game for a lot of the reasons that we've talked about down through the years so many times. This one we don't talk about quite as much, but it's also one of the big reasons why. You care, therefore you watch. And even people outside of the Ohio State and Michigan footprint, outside of the fan bases, watch the game. Even people outside the Big Ten, from coast to coast, watch the game. And of course, the greater the importance of the game, the more people watch. Let's look at Ohio State and Michigan. Since we can go through the ratings on Sports Media Watch, that's where we're taking our information for our series. And of course, check out the videos down in the comments section below. 8.5 million people watched the undefeated Ohio State team complete that 12-0 season over Michigan 26-21. That game was broadcast on ABC and was the second highest rated game of the week to USC and Notre Dame. In 2013, Ohio State capped off another undefeated regular season against Michigan with a close ball game, 42-41. 9.5 million watched it. It was the second highest rated game of the week to the kick six Alabama-Auburn finish. 2014, Ohio State won the national championship. En route, they beat Michigan, of course. Over 8 million people watched the game on ABC. It was the second rated game of the week to Bama-Auburn. In 2015, Ohio State and Michigan eclipsed 10 million viewers. Number one game of the week on ABC. Ohio State won 42-13. In 2016, one of the great games in the history of the rivalry propelled Ohio State to the college football playoff, kept Michigan from the Big Ten championship game, and over 16.8 million people watched it as Ohio State and Michigan waged war on ABC for the final time. In 2017, Fox took over this rivalry, basically taking over the Big Ten contract in terms of having the preferential matchups. And of course, Fox selects this game as its primary game each and every year. 10.5 million people watched Ohio State's win over Michigan in Ann Arbor, the second highest rated game of 2017 to Alabama-Auburn. As we move it up to 2018, the game eclipsed 13 million viewers. From Columbus, Ohio State put up 63 points and beat Michigan in that matchup that was the number one rated game of the week. In 2019, the two matched up in Ann Arbor again on Thanksgiving weekend. Ohio State won this one big, 56-27. 12.4 million watched it as the number one game of the week. Two teams did not play in 2020. Then in 2021, of course, the first of these three monumental matchups for the Big Ten East and spot in the Big Ten championship game, with both teams either undefeated or with one loss. The 2021 game neared 16 million views, number one on the week and the season. The 2022 matchup, over 17 million, number one game of the week and the season. And again, here in 2023, the viewership has just exploded in recent years. Over 19 million people watched the number one game of the week and of all of college football, excluding college football playoff games on Fox. So we're not necessarily revealing anything revolutionary when we let you know that Ohio State and Michigan draw the best views in college football typically, or are in the top two or three. That is a given. But what about when they play other teams? How do they stack up against each other in regards to popularity and viewership? And if we get enough popularity and viewership for some of these videos, we will continue to take deeper and deeper dives into this analysis, because I would love to go through all the teams in the country and stack up the most popular teams for whether that be just 2023 or looking back several seasons. So let's look at Ohio State and Michigan, how they stacked up in these past three seasons, because let's face it, before 2021, there would be no comparison between Ohio State and Michigan in regards to popularity or in terms of viewership. So many more people were watching Ohio State when they were among the elite versus Michigan being just a good, typically 9-3 team under Jim Harbaugh the viewership would not be close. But let's look during this Michigan surge of 2021, 22, 23 and see how they compare against Ohio State in like games. In 2023, of course, they both played Michigan State, and Michigan drew a few more viewers, 3.73 to 3.57 million. Both of those games were played on NBC. Against Maryland, Michigan drew about 1 million more viewers, both games on Fox at noon, 5.4 million against 4.5 million. The Indiana matchup did better for Ohio State on CBS than the Fox game for Michigan, at 4.65 million viewers for Ohio State and Indiana on opening weekend versus Michigan IU. The Rutgers game for Michigan, it was on the Big Ten Network. That's going to drop the viewership 1.9 million compared to 3.96, basically 4 million on CBS for Ohio State and Rutgers. The Minnesota matchup, we've got 3.06 million for the matchup Michigan-Minnesota on NBC. Ohio State and Michigan played on the Big Ten Network, and this was the highest rated, most viewed game on the Big Ten Network the entire season. The Buckeyes and the Gophers, 2.02 million. Both Ohio State and Michigan took on Purdue. However, we don't have viewership totals for Ohio State-Purdue because they played on Peacock. The game on NBC between the Wolverines and the Boilers drew 2.6 million. So for the 5 games that we can match up directly, we've got 17.7 million views for Michigan in those 5 games, 18.7 million, about 1 million more views for the Buckeyes against those 5 opponents, or an average of 200,000 more per game. Also keep in mind that in similar regular season matchups, Ohio State took on Wisconsin, primetime game on NBC, drew almost 5 million viewers. Likewise, let's look at Michigan-Nebraska. That was their most popular game outside of the games that we just showed. Michigan-Nebraska on ABC at 4.48 million. Ohio State and Notre Dame was the highest rated non-conference matchup of the entire season at 9.98 million on NBC. And then for Michigan, of course, their high-profile matchups at the end of the season because they were undefeated, had a great season, move on to the Big Ten championship game where they took on Iowa in front of 10-plus million. The Bama game had a ridiculous viewership at 27.7 million at the Rose Bowl. Then the national championship game, about 2.5 million less. Michigan beat Washington by 21 points, and that game drew 25 million on ESPN. So Ohio State wins a few matchups, Michigan wins a few matchups. Let's take it back to 2022 and see if the trends continue. They both played Michigan State in 22. The Michigan-Michigan State matchup, that was the one on ABC in primetime where there was the fight in the tunnel after the game. 5.6 million watched it compared to 4.44 for an ABC matchup between Ohio State and Michigan State. Against Maryland, Michigan played them early in the season on Fox at noon in front of 4.38 million. The Ohio State-Maryland matchup was an entertaining late-season game in November in front of 6.6 million on ABC. The Indiana game, Michigan-IU outdrew Ohio State and IU 4.01 million on Fox compared to another Fox game, 3.34 for the Buckeyes and the Hoosiers. Against Rutgers, Michigan drew a Big Ten Network assignment, so did the Buckeyes. That Ohio State-Rutgers game at 1.79 million for 2022, the highest rated game for the network for the entire college football season in 22. And then finally, nice matchup against Iowa. Iowa brings eyeballs, as does, of course, Ohio State and Michigan, so 4.2 million for a 27-14 Wolverines win on Fox at noon Eastern. And the Buckeyes game against Iowa, we can rate it with the same network, the same time slot. So this is a fair comparison at 4.38 million, or about 200,000 more people watched Ohio State and Iowa. So put it all together with 5 like matchups. You got 18.46 million watched the Michigan games against those teams, 20.01, just over 20 million for the Buckeyes against those 5 Big Ten teams. Once again, Ohio State-Notre Dame was the crown jewel of the non-conference games in terms of viewership on TV. In 2022, that game was a primetime game on ABC. It drew 10.5 million viewers. In addition, Ohio State, of course, went to the college football playoff. And when they got together with Georgia for a 42-41 game, 22.45 million people watched that game. Compared to Michigan's big non-Big Ten matchups, meaning regular season, against Purdue in the conference championship game, 10.7 million in a pretty easy Michigan win there, 43-22. And then you've got the TCU game for the national semifinal. That game was just in front of the Ohio State-Georgia matchup that drew about 800,000 less than Ohio State and Georgia. Of course, going into 2021, Ohio State was a heavy favorite in the Big Ten. They had won the conference championship in 2017, 18, and 19, also in 2020. 4 consecutive Big Ten championships. Didn't get a chance to beat Michigan in 2020, but had all those 8 consecutive wins. So this was Michigan's surge back to take over the rivalry, win the Big Ten championship in 2021, that magical season. Let's see how the Wolverines drew on TV. So against Michigan State, as you recall, this was a huge matchup that actually the Spartans won 37-33. So great football game on Fox at noon, and Michigan State was a 10-2 football team that year, 11-2 with the Peach Bowl win. 9.28 million people watched it, compared to a really good crowd for the matchup against Ohio State, but nothing close to it. Now, at the same time, Ohio State just drubbed Michigan State. It was 49-0 at halftime. So you got to think just about everybody, including myself, checked out of that game at 49-0 at halftime, even though it was a top 10 matchup. 5.28 million, exactly 4 million less for Ohio State and Michigan State. Against Maryland, not a fair comparison here because Michigan and Maryland played on the Big Ten Network, 1.23 million against 2.78 million for Ohio State and blowing out the Terps in 2021. The Indiana matchup was fairly comparable, although the Buckeyes drew more fans to the TV sets by about 700,000, 3.34 against 2.68. That Fox game was the destination for Indiana and Michigan in 21. The Rutgers matchup can't really be compared because Michigan played Rutgers on ABC in front of 2.8 million. It was a pretty competitive game at 20-13. Ohio State and Rutgers played on BTN. And then the Nebraska matchup for the Buckeyes and the Huskers, 5.33 million on Fox. The ABC network took Michigan and Nebraska at 4.63. And both of those games were really good games. 32-29 Michigan and 26-17 Ohio State. So 2 really good matchups. Ohio State and Nebraska played on Fox at noon Eastern, and the ABC game between the Maize and Blue and GBR was a primetime game. Out of conference, Ohio State-Oregon on Fox was a major matchup. 7.7 million people watched it. And then also Ohio State missed the playoffs, went to the Rose Bowl, and 16.63 million people watched it, which was very close to a college football playoff audience. For Michigan, they took on Washington as their quote-unquote big non-conference matchup. It was on ABC in front of 4.7 million. The Huskies, at that point, were thought to be a good team. They ended up going 4-8. And then, of course, Michigan got blown out by Georgia in the national semifinal at the Orange Bowl in front of 17.19 million, just about 500,000 more than watched the Rose Bowl. Let's continue on back through the college football playoff era and match up the Buckeyes and the Wolverines in their Big Ten championship games and then also in their playoff appearances to see if either one has an edge there. We checked out Michigan's numbers in the Big Ten championship against Iowa twice and Purdue once at 11.65, 10.7, and 10.2 million viewers. Contrast that to the Buckeyes' games in the Big Ten title matchup against Wisconsin in 2014 and 17 at 6.1 million that watched the 59-0 game. And I don't know if that's just a lot of people checking out at that point because it was such a blowout. They played a competitive game, 27-21 in 17, and so many more people watched that game at 12.9 million. And then in 2018 against Northwestern, okay, a non-marquee matchup considering Northwestern doesn't bring many eyeballs to the TV screens. That's obvious. In addition to that, Ohio State had a slim chance of overtaking Oklahoma for a college football playoff appearance, so 8.6 million watched that matchup. And then against Wisconsin in 2019, the Buckeyes were undefeated, but trailing at halftime. Really good ball game. 13.5 million people watched it. And then again against Northwestern in 2020, only 8 million people watched it. So when the Buckeyes take on Northwestern, about 2 million less watched that game than Michigan's matchups against Iowa and Purdue. But then when the Buckeyes take on Wisconsin in those two matchups, you're looking at 13 million, as you got to think better matchup, better ball game, and the Badgers bringing some more eyeballs possibly to the TV screens. Again, we checked out Michigan's showings in the college football playoff in regards to popularity. Bama, Washington this past year at 27.7 and 25.05 in those two ball games. The game against TCU in 2022 at 21.7, and then again the Georgia matchup in 2021 at 17.19. Compare that to the Buckeyes college football playoff games. Against Alabama in 2014, 28.27. So that's about 500,000 more than the Michigan-Bama matchup in the Rose Bowl this past season. And then when Ohio State played Oregon in the national championship game, 34.15. I believe that is the best national championship game showing. 34+ million people watched it. Ohio State Clemson in 2016 at over 19 million. In 2019, Clemson, Ohio State, 21+ million for an excellent football game. And then in 2020, Ohio State beat Clemson by 3 touchdowns. In the COVID year of 2020, just less people watch college football. The season was upset. It was started late. The Pac-12 was completely taken out for the most part with only 4 and 5 games played. Just ratings were down significantly for everyone. What's interesting here is more people watched Ohio State beat Clemson than watched Bama beat Ohio State in the national championship game at 18.65 million. And so when we boil it down to averages, there are the Buckeyes' 5 Big Ten championship games in the college football playoff era versus Michigan's 3 the past 3 seasons. And then in the college football playoff, the Buckeyes have 7 games going back to 2014, 3 wins and 4 losses. There you see the averages matched up against Michigan's 4 games, 2 wins and 2 losses. Pretty close numbers between Ohio State and Michigan since they've both been elite. That's only been 3 seasons, 21, 22, 23. Again, Ohio State would blow Michigan away earlier when Michigan was either just a top 10 or 15 team under Harbaugh, or before that when they were down. This could be an interesting comparison, though. Let's go one more angle at this. The biggest matchup for both of these teams outside of their game is, of course, against Penn State. Penn State's been the other top team in the Big Ten since 2016. That was the season they broke through, beat Ohio State and Michigan, went to the Rose Bowl, won the Big Ten championship, and since then, aside from 2021 at 7-6, they have been a really good football team. They've won a Fiesta Bowl, Cotton Bowl, Rose Bowl. And again, they have been the other big matchup for these two teams that have drawn big numbers. But let's compare those big numbers. Ohio State, Penn State against Michigan, Penn State. In 2023, Ohio State took on Penn State in October at 9.96 million. Almost 10 million people watched it at noon on Fox. The Michigan game in Happy Valley later in the season, a little bit more controversy. Michigan's undefeated. I think there was a little bit more juice going into this game because we knew at that point Michigan's playing for a Big Ten championship. They're about to play Ohio State. This is enormous coming down the stretch. So bigger stakes in November, but 800,000 less people watched Michigan against Penn State. In terms of the attractiveness of the games, they were both about the same. Both Ohio State and Michigan controlled the game, did not blow out Penn State by any stretch, but they controlled the football game. In 2022, Ohio State and Penn State played a heck of a ball game. 8.2 million people watched it on Fox. Michigan and Penn State were playing a 16-14 game in the third quarter, and then Michigan just blew them out late third quarter and fourth quarter, and significantly less people watched that. About 1.8 million less people watched Michigan Penn State on Fox than Ohio State Penn State on Fox. In 2021, we again had primetime matchups: Ohio State Penn State, Michigan Penn State, ABC games. Over 7 million people watched Ohio State and Penn State, as opposed to Michigan Penn State at just under 6 million. About 1.1 million more watched Ohio State play Penn State. In 2020, you can throw this out to a certain extent. Ohio State, Penn State, of course, the Buckeyes went to the national championship game, so their season still mattered. At the point that they played Penn State, they were coming off that loss to Indiana, the Michael Penix dive at the pylon, and the Buckeyes won the game against Penn State. Now, Michigan, Penn State, at the point that they played, neither team had much going at that point. Wolverines en route to 2-4. Penn State finished at 4-5, and just over 4 million people watched the game on ABC at noon. 2019, Ohio State marching to a Big Ten championship and undefeated regular season. Good ball game against Penn State. 9.4 million watched it on Fox. Versus the Michigan matchup against Penn State, 6.6 million. So significantly more people watching Ohio State and Penn State play at this point. 2018. Great game between Ohio State and Penn State in primetime on ABC. As the Buckeyes pulled it out, they were down 26-14 in the fourth quarter, scored 2 touchdowns to win. Over 9 million people watched it. Michigan, Penn State, they played on ESPN with a viewership of 4.25 million. In 2017, the Buckeyes trailed by a couple touchdowns many times in this game, trailed by 18, pulled out a miracle finish, 39-38. Great game in Columbus on Fox. 9.87 million people watched it versus the Michigan-Penn State matchup, with the Wolverines finishing at 8-5 that year. Penn State was a better team at 11-2 and won the Fiesta Bowl. 6.95 million people watched it on ABC. In 2016, ABC aired both the Ohio State, Penn State, and Michigan, Penn State games. 6.47 million people watched Ohio State, Penn State, as opposed to 2.7 million less watching the Maize and Blue and the Nittany Lions. In 2015, both games on ABC. This a rarity. This would be the only time thus far Michigan, Penn State drew more people than Ohio State, Penn State by a smidge, 6.1 million to 5.8 million. In 2014, we got Ohio State and Penn State drawing 4.6 million on ABC. Michigan, of course, a 5-7 football team in 2014 under Brady Hoke. Only 2.3 million people watched that Michigan team take on a Penn State team that finished 7-6. Of course, the Ohio State matchup against Penn State, they went to overtime, and the Buckeyes marched on to a national championship. In 2013, the Buckeyes went through an undefeated regular season, including a win over Penn State on ABC, and they crushed Penn State, I believe, 63-14 in that game. Michigan, Penn State played on ESPN. Just about exactly the same amount of people watched the two games. And then in 2012, Michigan did not play Penn State. Ohio State played Penn State on ESPN in front of 3.9 million people. So I'm a bit surprised at these totals, as during this stretch that takes us back to 2013, 81 plus million people watched Ohio State, Penn State. Only 59 million people watched Michigan, Penn State during that time. So interesting to match these things up. Love to do the TV breakdowns. If you've got any requests, let me know. I'm going to dive further into this if our viewership here at the Voice of College Football justifies it. Please hit the like button and subscribe. Why do you subscribe? Well, if you like what we do here at the Voice of College Football, you should just flat out subscribe to help us grow and build the channel. It also allows you to hit the notifications to know when we go live. Give me a call. Next live show, would love to hear from you right here at the Voice of College Football.